Hello friends, my name is Marie-Helene and these are my top 10 reads of 2024. Number 10 is The Adventures of Amina al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. This is an adult fantasy novel that follows famous pirate Amina al-Sirafi. She has since retired to a life of motherhood, but she is pulled back into the life when the mother of a former crewman finds her and offers her a fortune in order to retrieve a kidnapped girl. What begins as a seemingly straightforward mission quickly unravels into something much more dangerous. It is a journey filled with supernatural forces and old grudges and people from her past, and the ultimate price that Amina has to pay for this fortune is greater than she anticipated. To me, this book is the definition of escapism. A lot of the other entries that you'll see on this list are going to be very thematically heavy because that is what I really enjoy in a book. And Amina certainly has things to say, but it is also just incredibly fun. When I say that I want like an escapist sort of fantasy, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It is an incredibly rich world, but it also has very smooth and competent writing, and that let me sort of fully immerse into the world, and it made it very difficult to put down the book. I think I read it along the course of one day. I made a video while I was reading it, and I just kind of gobbled it up. Amina herself, the character, is a standout here. At first, I was like kind of passively enjoying her. Like I liked the character, but in no real way that I thought was super memorable. But the more the story went on, the more my love for her increased. I found her an incredibly multifaceted character. She's a fierce pirate captain, but she's also a mother. She's grappling with chronic pain. She's an older character as well, which is something that you don't always see in these kinds of fantasies. So she's dealing with the way that she's not the person that she was before, both physically and just being sort of like tired spiritually. And because she has all of this experience, she also has a complex past. And I loved that she had like a sense of duty about her. There was grit to her as well, and she was willing to do the hard things and to make tough decisions, but there was still ultimately a sense of duty that underlined all of that. Her narrative voice felt perfect for this kind of story. She had like a dry wit to her that I found really funny. Amina was also really resourceful, and I think that there was a level of self-awareness here that I appreciated. Like, she understood who she was as a person, and it wasn't that she wasn't dynamic, it was that her like strengths were able to coexist with her weaknesses in the story. I also really loved all of the relationships with her crew here. This is a gotta get the gang back together sort of story. I love those kinds of stories, and I appreciated all of the different dynamics within the crew. And this was pretty surprising to me, but I loved her relationship with the demon in the story, which is exactly the kind of relationship that usually doesn't work for me. It is not my jam, but there was something about this that I think worked really well. I think maybe because Amina is an older character and she does have that self-awareness, I found the demon character like infuriating and intriguing. And so it made it easy to understand Amina's reactions to the character because I was having similar reactions myself. I would say that the one big flaw of this book is that it does have like two different tones throughout. There is a portion of this that does feel more like a reimagined history and another portion that feels more fantastical. And I don't think that those two tones were always very seamlessly integrated. And so I can see that being a thing that pulls people out of the immersion because you almost start getting a different book. But I think that if you go in knowing that it kind of gets a little goofy with its magic and its creatures and its places, but still has that alternative history running through it, I think you can be prepared. It didn't take away from my enjoyment overall, but when we're talking about like ranking my favorites of the year, I can step back and see that that could have been a little tightened. I love the way that this ended off and like set up Amina for future adventures. I would read 100 adventures. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I do love me a long running series, so it's only a little bit of an exaggeration. But I would definitely read more about plot Amina and this crew, and the way that the story kind of shifts at the end so that you really understand like what's next for this character. When I finished it, I wasn't sure like how memorable it would be, but a couple of months on, there are like scenes from this that I still remember very vividly, and more than anything, like Amina herself, I think, is a very memorable character, and that's why I would follow her on more adventures. Number 9 is To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Moniquill Blackgoose. This is a crossover fantasy. It is published by Del Rey as an adult book, and the main character is 15, but that is an adult in her culture, so this really does have a lot of crossover appeal. But we follow this main character, Anacus, who is an indigenous girl who bonds with a newly hatched dragon. This thrusts her into a colonizer-run dragon academy, all while ensuring the safety of her dragon in this environment where they are both being treated with a lot of suspicion and hostility, and she goes there with the aim of trying to gain knowledge to bring back to her people. This is one of those stories that every time I think about it, like I genuinely feel warm and fuzzy and giddy inside, and a lot of that has to do with the strength of Anacus as a main character. This is a story that uses one of my favorite story structures if it is well deployed. If it is well deployed, I love when we have a hero who has a flat arc, and where the question is less about like self-discovery and more about like maybe the type of hero that they want to be. The example that I always give is of one of my favorite superheroes, which is Superman, where like Superman is a good person at his core, and he is often answering the question of what kind of hero he wants to be. And I found that we had a really well deployed flat arc in Anacus's story. She has a very well defined sense of self and sense of morality, sense of her own culture. As a character, Anacus doesn't have to go through a dramatic transformation to discover who she is. Instead, this is a story about her sense of self and her steadfastness in the midst of a system that is designed to erase or break her. Having this kind of character at the heart of the story does give it a sort of coziness. I would not call this cozy because it is dealing very much so with colonialism and racism and misogyny and cultural genocide. So these are very hard-hitting topics that I don't think are always what you think of when you use like the blanket term cozy, but the approach to these topics is very character focused and it is very community focused. And I think because you have a character like Anacus who is so grounded in her sense of self, and we watch her throughout this build a community around her, it does give the story that warmth. I loved watching the main character form all of these relationships, whether they were with her dragon, which love a good like dragon human bond, or with her family and the complicated dynamics that she has with them because she has left and is now at this colonizer school, or with the other students that she's building this like found family with. I found it so funny the way that these relationships were formed because again, we have this character who is so firmly rooted in her sense of self. She was like pulling people towards her that weren't necessarily that way. Like, I don't want to say that she bullied people into being friends with her, but there was such a really funny sort of way that she was like, no, you're my, like, I like you, you like me, we're friends. And a lot of the people that she attracted were a little hesitant about that, but she just didn't let that hesitation stop her from forming these relationships. I really enjoyed the 2 different romantic relationships that we got in here and how they highlighted different things about each of those characters and our main character. So while we have this big set piece of this dragon school and these big thematic things that it is exploring, there's also a way that the story is very grounded. There aren't these huge plot twists that are pushing the narrative forward, but there are still plenty of plot moments that were satisfying, things that Anacus is like learning and discovering that I thought still created plenty of momentum and kept me turning pages. While this world is not our world, I think that there were enough clear parallels and influences that allow all of Blackgoose's thematic work to hit even harder. It highlights all of the harm of colonialism, but it takes so much care to also celebrate the strengths and the beauty of indigenous culture. For something that has taken so many very, very well-worn in tropes like Dragon School and A Chosen One and all of that, I thought that this was just really lovely. And it felt like Blackgoose breathed some freshness into it. And I just cannot wait until we get an announcement about the second book. because this has so much potential to continue to grow in scope and mature with its characters. And I want to get to the end. I want to see Anakusa's like happily ever after at the end. Like, I need it for myself. Number 8 is Penance by Eliza Clark, and this is a literary thriller that follows a journalist as he attempts to construct the definitive account of the murder of a 16-year-old girl named Joan Wilson, a crime that shook a small seaside town of Crow-on-Sea nearly a decade before the events of the book. This book was truly an experience. That's what I found like most memorable about this book, not necessarily like the plot beats, but just the way that it made me feel and the way that it made me think. It took me a while to get into the story and to like really wrap my hands around like the project of it. I was reading it for a while going, okay, like what, I think especially because I got the recommendation from my Discord and hearing them talk about it, like I started to read and the way that they were talking about it wasn't necessarily lining up with like the story that I was getting. That felt like a very straightforward true crimey approximation. So it took me a while to settle into the story, but genuinely after I turned the last page, I had to just like sit and stare at a wall for a moment or 20. Truly, while you are reading, it is very easy to sit back and criticize the fictional characters who were very self-serving in their hunger for answers about this crime and in like the way that they were crafting the narrative about this crime. But then I found myself like wanting exactly the same things. Like I started to want answers. I started to want like clean answers apart from the complications of these complex characters. I wanted a why, I wanted details, and I wanted those things to feel satisfying. And even though you start the book knowing what happens, you know what the outcome of this crime is, I couldn't help but be drawn into the story, like as I was seeking that same sense of closure and justice that the narrative itself was questioning. That tension between the things that I wanted as a reader and what the book was willing to give me as a reader, it made it like a truly sort of fascinating read. I found Clark's writing to be incredibly sharp, especially in the way that she was building these characters and painting these portraits. She gave us very well-defined and difficult to look away from characters. I think the cast of girls at the heart of Penance are especially complex people. They have so many flaws and contradictions and rich inner lives in a way that is very teen girl, but also like very human. I think one of the most interesting pieces of commentary offered here, which is like ultimately an offshoot of all of the commentary that it's giving about true crime and like the true crime genre, is about online communities. Everything Clark said about online communities felt like a read. I was like screaming in the way that she showed us both the belonging aspect and the radicalization that one of the characters found in this like deeply niche online community. It was, you can tell that Clark has been through the trenches. This isn't a book that gives you a tidy resolution or ending or that sense of justice. Instead, it left me sitting with the messiness of it all, like the messiness of human behavior and the uncomfortable realization that even when fueled by like a wanting for justice or a sense of truth or empathy or any of those things, the stories that we consume and the stories we shape will always be informed by our own biases and by our own desires. Number 7 is How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo, and this is a collection of essays that examines the politics and the ethics of reading, thinking about how we engage not just with books and art, but also the histories and the power structures that shape them. I got so much out of this essay collection, and you can really tell by the sheer number of times that I have referenced it since I read it. Like, there are so many times that I have pulled quotes in order to inform or support other thoughts that I'm having about media. You guys know how much I love not just talking about media, but talking about how we talk about media. And How to Read Now gave me so much language to frame some of those conversations in like newer ways. And it even helped me track some of the progression of my own thinking, seeing Castillo really dive into the messy, nuanced ways of how we consume and how we discuss books and art and culture. I loved the framework of like being readers not only of books, but but of like media in general and of society. I loved that framework so much because it has really also helped me understand the way that I navigate social media and reading spaces within social media as well, like thinking about that collection of people as readers, like how did we get to be such bad readers? And I think the question of how do we become better readers is what Castillo is interested in exploring. And it truly, to me, is an exploration because you're not going to get like easy answers of right or wrong here or any sort of reductive arguments, but like there is a push to just engage with media, especially as it interacts with society and context and history as a sort of like living and breathing entity. I think some of the things that stuck out to me in this were the way that Castillo challenges the idea of positive representation. That is language that I have definitely used before, that I had already really started to be questioning, especially through like a onslaught of reviews where people were taking the fact that works have something in them as negative representation, or as like if something depicts racism, this is racist sort of narratives. And so like I really started to think on my own about the way we talk about representation as being positive or negative instead of thinking more about the messages. And this had so much to say about that idea that it was just like praise handsing my way through as I read it. In this, she also has an essay about Joan Didion. I'm not at all familiar with Didion's work, but it is such it is such a takedown. But I think that if you enjoy just like a well-worded, well-thought, well-supported, scathing sort of review, I think that you would enjoy just like that essay on its own, even without the context. Like I, again, did not have the context of the work itself. I just really appreciated like the very informed, big-brained way that she was a hater. That's a little reductive to Castillo, but I want to convey the vibes. I also just really loved the writing style in this. I think that Castillo is very witty. There was so much like humor to be found here. It was smart and it was biting. I think that she's often being generous even in her critique, but she is brutally honest. Number 6 is They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Adurraqib. This is also a collection of essays that uses music and culture as a lens to explore grief and identity and the complexity of being alive in a world that often feels impossible to navigate. I could quote like entire sections, whole essays of this book because it hit me very, very deeply. I think Adurraqib has this like very singular and incredible ability to make you feel as though you are in conversation with him. You are sitting across from your smartest friend having a conversation that's really intimate, it's really expansive, it's really expressive, that he's making all of these connections and ties that leaves you feeling in awe and almost smarter by association. Even when he was writing about artists or genres or cultural moments that I really wasn't familiar with, there's a way that his words make you understand what he's talking about. There's so much passion and precision and earnestness in his ability to make what is personal to him and translate it into something universal and apply it to like a wider pattern that he is talking about. I think the thing that I wasn't expecting when I went into this, knowing that it was going to be talking a lot about music, is that this is a grief book. I love a good book about grief, as you guys know, but I wasn't expecting it here. And I wasn't expecting how this was about so many different kinds of grief. Grief for loved ones, grief for communities, grief for moments lost to time, grief for violence. And yet, through all that it is saying about loss, it is not only just a book about loss. It ends up being this love letter to all of the things that sustain us through loss, like music, like art, like people, like community. I think Adurraqib is such a talented writer, such a smart one, and truly, truly, I think he is one of my favorite people writing nonfiction right now, and like overall, just one of my favorite authors. His works always land for me. He could write about anything. He could write about any subject, truly, any sport, any music, any genre, any piece of art, and I will be there because I trust him to take what is very specific, not only to him, but to the overall theme that he's using and show us the way that it applies to so many other things at large with people, with society. Number 5 is Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. This is a speculative dystopian novel that follows Loretta Thurwar and Hurricane Marie-Helene stacks, and they are two gladiators fighting for their freedom in this brutal program that uses prisoners as entertainment as they compete in death matches for the chance to win their release. When I talked about this book, I talked about it together with Penance because I think that this is another example of a book that implicates the reader. It is absolutely heartbreaking and brutal. It is the kind of story that refuses to let you be a passive observer. The violence and the exploitation of this fictional prison program are horrifying, but they're also disturbingly familiar. They very much mirror real-world commodification of Black and brown bodies in our own society. There are certainly stories that I think approach their thematic content softly, and then there are works like Chain Gang All-Stars that grab you by the shoulders and demand that you pay attention. It does not at all shy away from the brutality of its subject matter, and it doesn't let you either. These death matches are grotesque, and they are an exaggeration of systems that we can recognize in our own world, and at the same time, they are so logical. They are such a logical extension of the systems that we can see visible in our world that it feels sort of like horrifyingly plausible. This is a book that made me think so much, not only about the book itself, but about how it is perceived. Like, I had a lot of thoughts just about the reception of this book. Firstly, about a demand that violent systems of oppression be portrayed with nuance, and that there is no place for this kind of bold reckoning with these systems of oppression. And second, about this idea that the characters in this book are distant or difficult to connect with, or somehow not engaging or not relatable enough. I absolutely know that those are fine critiques to make of any works, to be clear, but they are gutting to me, specifically as critiques of this work, just because they feel so close, so painfully close to what Adjei-Brenyah is exploring in this book. The system that he created in Chain Gang All-Stars is specifically designed to strip these characters of their humanity. They are rendered as disposable. They are rendered as less than human. They are commodified. And in this way, that those critiques of them as characters like mirror that dehumanization, there's a way that asking for these characters to be more relatable, to bleed more, further commodifies like the bodies of Black and brown people. It feels like such a painful reflection of how society often fails to fully see or fully empathize with those who are marginalized or oppressed. The demand for more relatable characters in a story like this feels like a desire to soften the edges of a story that is not interested at all in being soft. I found Loretta and Stax to be remarkable protagonists, and not because they fit into any sort of tidy archetypes or character tropes, or because I found them particularly easy to connect with. I do think that we did see a lot of humanity through them, and often that humanity had to shine through the cracks of the system that was built to dehumanize them. There was so much intimacy, I think, in the portrayal of these characters, especially because this is a system that refuses to give these people privacy, and so we are almost forced to be sort of like intimately aware of what these characters are doing and how they are living their lives. Adjei-Brenyah also very masterfully expands the narrative beyond the arena and beyond the gladiators. We get this like patchwork of other perspectives and just a variety of characters that really help to fill out like this idea of what would it take for a society, our society specifically, to get here, and how might we react in this situation, and what kind of social structure would be needed to support something like this, which honestly isn't that difficult to imagine, considering the way that humans adapt to things very easily and very quickly, especially atrocities, how easily we can become sort of like immune to the atrocities that we see. So this asks you about like all levels of society, what would need to be the interconnectedness there in order to support a program like this, from like corporate greed at the top all the way to the person who is watching this at home. Because ultimately this book isn't just a critique of the prison industrial complex, it is also an exploration of like power in general and the cost of freedom in a society that commodifies human lives and that is very interested in caste systems. I think that this was incredibly bold, and I just have not been able to stop thinking about it. Number 4 is Beautyland by Marie-Helene Bertino. This is a speculative novel about a girl named Adina, and she is born with this knowledge of like a faraway planet. She knows that she is an alien. And so from her childhood in Philadelphia, she is tasked with sending these transmissions via fax machine to her alien relatives, reporting on like the experience of being a human. As we watch her grow up, we also watch her grapple with what it means to belong both to Earth and to feel alien. What a little gem of a book. This is one of those stories that feels really quiet in its delivery, but just resonated super deeply with me. I really enjoy stories that are very earnest in their approach. I think that it takes courage to be earnest, and I think I'm still recovering from the oversaturation of like the morally gray and everything needing to be sort of like ironic and gritty. So when I come across something that is sort of unapologetically earnest, it warms me. What can I say? I also really enjoy books like this that are like speculative and literary, that take its speculative element in order to explore something that is more character focused or emotional. And that happens here, where it's less concerned with like the fax machine and the aliens. And I mean, there is this question of like, is she really an alien, that you're kind of grappling with throughout? But the thing that it really wants to explore is like growing up and like life, and how weird and hard it is, and how it can be beautiful, especially as you're going through like first loves and first losses, and trying to capture what that experience is like and communicate it to somebody else, of like what it is to be human. And so in that way, this idea of like transmissions to an alien race like really sets up a beautiful framework to do that. The narrative voice in this also really worked for me. If you're trying to capture like the two ends of what this character would be feeling, as both like deeply human and feeling very alien, I think that this did that successfully in its sort of observations. There's nothing here that feels like incredibly deep or intricate, but I think that there is value in a lot of the like simple ways that it communicates things that you feel like, oh, ooh, me too. Ultimately, Adina is an alien, maybe, but her struggles with identity and her feelings of exile and her longing for home and connection are very, very profoundly human and well communicated in this endearing book. Number 3 is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman. This is a post-apocalyptic novel that begins in a cage deep underground where 39 women are being held captive. Among them is the youngest prisoner, a girl who feels like she sits apart from the rest of them because she has no recollection of a life outside of captivity where these other women do. She becomes the key to their ultimate escape, but what they escape into is a very strange and desolate world above, and it does offer them freedom, but very, very few answers. I thought this book was absolutely devastating in a very short, tight, and compact way. It manages to not only say so much, but invite you to think so much in a very small package. In this book, Harpman doesn't really concern herself with the mechanics of the world building or the answers to the questions that she poses about the world, about what happened, why were they in the cage, and once they get out, why is the world the way that they encounter it? Like, those are questions that we have as a reader that aren't really the point of the story and that Harpman doesn't care to answer. Instead, she uses the dystopian premise as a framework to ask much larger questions about humanity and survival and what makes us human, where there is like some innate quality of humanity that we have, or if it's all built through socialization and relationship. I think this also had a lot to say about motivation and what keeps us motivated to live in very difficult circumstances. If you knew you were the only people alive, what would be the thing driving you to continue to live? And it asks that question for the people who do have context of a life before, and for the one person who does not have that context. I think it is probably always pretty timely to ask about what motivates us in moments of hopelessness. Because our narrator has only known life in captivity, there is this sort of innocence to her point of view, or a simplicity to the way that she is delivering the story. There is a matter-of-factness to the way that she approaches the world. And in some ways, it feels like she is not burdened under the context of knowing how things were before. And so she is much more able to deal with things in a matter-of-fact basis of like, this is the way that they are. It gives us a very moving perspective to watch somebody navigate the world like without understanding the world. And her perspective invites us to continue to ask questions about how we move through the world, where we find hope, and where we form relationships. A big portion of the novel is just exploring the relationships between these women, and again, how they form connections and the kind of community that they form, and how each of their different personalities sort of exist within this idea of like just seeing the same 38 other women over and over again. There's a way that Harpman captures all of those little interactions and all of the problems that they face in a really, really human and intimate and heartbreaking way. I think the main thing that will stay with me about this whole experience was the ending. It was absolutely open-ended. And I kind of have a feeling as I was reading that we wouldn't truly get like an answer, but when you get to the end of the story and it is so open-ended, it is like this additional gut punch in the entire experience. But it is one that, again, invites you to continue your role as a reader and thinking about like the larger things that Harpman is sort of questioning and asking and proposing to you. I think there is a way that the ending also sort of implies something additional outside of what is written, because we are reading the story in this account and these words that I found really interesting and like slightly hopeful. And I don't know if that was me like doing my best to read some hope into the situation, but everything about like the entire thought process and how it sat with me and how I kept trying to like turn over all of these little pieces of this story that is told with such economy, I think is why this is so high up on my list, especially for a book where the prose itself felt really sparse. It was beautiful in the way that it felt deliberate. This is exactly the kind of book that ticks a lot of Mari boxes in terms of being thematically rich and emotionally devastating. Which, speaking of, number 2 is James by Percival Everett. This is a reimagining of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn that shifts the focus to one of the characters in that work, Jim, an enslaved man, and it shows us him running away once he learns that he is to be sold off and separated from his family, and it crosses over in places from scenes that were in Huckleberry Finn, but expands a lot on who Jim is and his journey. This is going to, or has already shown up on best of the year lists all over the place. It won the National Book Award, so it's probably no surprise to also see it show up on my list. I didn't actually read this until December 31st. And I felt like I was a little bit skeptical going into it because of all of the accolades, right? When you have like such high expectations, I was kind of like, we'll see. And then also I haven't read Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn in decades at this point. So I wasn't sure if I needed more context than hazy memories of excerpts decades ago in order to truly appreciate this. But man, it really, really won me over. Out of the gate, I think that there is something so wonderfully beautiful and ambitious about this project. Through James, Jim, the character, is no longer a passive participant in Huck's adventure. Instead, he's a man with his own goals and his own complexities and his own fight for survival and connection, all of which are really deftly handled by Everett. There is, I think, a beautiful like balance of tone throughout James, one that manages to be harrowing in a lot of places, but also like darkly funny in others. There are times where it feels really incisive and cutting, and times where it feels really tender and soft. This is my first Everett novel. What an introduction. You can just tell that this is an author who is a master of his craft. The way that Everett uses language feels genius. It is satirical, especially as it kind of explores the absurdity of all of these systems of oppression that Jim has to navigate, but it does that almost in a tone that I didn't expect. I loved that that was also balanced with like the underlying motivation for Jim in the story, which is to be reunited with his family. And I think that having that at the forefront balanced out the story, especially as we see Jim like going through these cycles of being brutalized and sold and like one step forward and 10 steps back and being sold again and brutalized again. And yet there was this constant like working towards being reunited with his family that I thought just kept everything really tight and on the rails. That being the inciting incident and that being like the motivational focus for Jim gives the novel its emotional core. One of the themes here that I found the most interesting and like juicy is this idea of the performance that is demanded by white supremacy. We see that in the language that Jim uses uses this idea of the slave filter and the way that he code switches and alters his demeanor in order to pacify the people around him, and his understanding that in order to survive, that he has to put on this performance. But we also see this in Everett's version of Huck Finn, and the way that his characterization becomes this reflection of privilege and ignorance that could be interpreted as innocence, but through this novel and how like sharp it is, you can tell that this is just another part of the performance of white supremacy. There are so many different layers to this book. I love that it is in conversation with the literary canon. I love that it's asking us to reconsider stories that we've long held as like classics. I love that it's asking us to look at this character that is considered a side character in some other person's journey. I love that it's asking us to look at how ridiculous the systems of oppression that founded this country are. I love that it asked us to look at James as this very complex character who ultimately was being motivated and pushed forward through the story because of a love of his family. I love the writing and the language of this. I am absolutely certain that I will get even more out of it if I reread it. And so yes, me along with everybody else. And my number one is The Spirit Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is an adult fantasy. It follows two main characters, Jun and Kima, and they are tasked with escorting an ancient god across a dangerous and fractured land in order to end the reign of her tyrant sons. This book is a masterpiece. It is incredibly ambitious. It is very much unlike most, if not all, of what I've read before. It is a story that is really interested in storytelling. It is a story that embraces complexity, and it asks you to embrace it as well. It invites you into a really rich and layered world, and it asks you to sit both with its beauty and its brutality. I think one of the most immediately striking things about this book is its structure and the way that you will tell right away that it is playing around with tense. It uses first and second and third tense, and the way that it's playing with stories within stories. It does take some attention at the beginning in order to really get into the groove of the storytelling. But I think that it settles into something that also feels like familiar for the way that it is in conversation with folklore and oral tradition and fairy tales. It very much has that feeling as well. You are being placed in a theater to watch a story unfold, but you are also being pulled in by that second person tense as you are being told the story about a story about a story. This is, to quote the book itself, a love story to its blade-dented bone. But it is not only romantic love. This is a love letter to storytelling. This is a love letter to culture and tradition. And it is also romantic love. I absolutely loved June and Kima. I loved their relationship. I love them as individual characters. I love how this story didn't romanticize either of these characters or the things that they had done in the past, or the complexities that they were dealing with on this journey together, or the difficulty what they were ultimately tasked with doing, which I think just made it all the more compelling to see these two characters interacting with each other. It becomes incredibly moving to see the arc of their story from that place of mistrust to something more. Again, it is very layered. It is the kind of writing that asks you to pay attention, but there were moments, snippets, and lines that truly like hit me so deeply that I found so beautiful without being overwrought. Like, it is playing with format and it is playing with style, but I think that it did so judiciously. This is another book on this list that feels like a patchwork that then starts to invite other perspectives and other narratives in order to really fill out what this world is, how it feels, and what the impact of like the story of our main characters is on like minor characters. Like those sort of interjections of all of these people who feel tangential to what the main story is, like giving them their moments, and oftentimes their like emotional weight, I thought was just incredibly lovely. If, as I've said a couple of times now, this is a book that demands your attention, I think that it is also one that rewards you for that attention. All of the weird bits of the story, from the god they are transporting to the turtles to these tyrannical leaders, like every piece of it felt so interesting, incredibly memorable. memorable to me, and absolutely one that could become a favorite of all time. I can't wait to reread it and see how well it holds up and how much more I get out of this in a second reading. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of my top 10 books of 2024, let's chat down in the comments. I will, of course, be back with the 10 worst books that I read in just a couple of days. And if you guys are interested in my top 11 to 20, that bonus video will be made available to my subscribers over on my Bindery. You can also follow me on Bindery for free, and that's where I will primarily be doing my written book reviews throughout the year. I haven't really been keeping up with Goodreads, and I've tried some of the alternatives and didn't super love them. So I don't know, I'm still kind of figuring out how I'm going to be doing my tracking in 2025, but I do know that the majority of like my written reviews and all of my essays and things along those lines will be on Mareas, and you can follow that for free. So I hope that you will go over there to keep up with my reading. I will link my bookshelf as well, so you guys can see things that I've recently talked about and things that I've recently read. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. I also was like posting every day in December for Vlogmas and doing 30 books in 31 days, and then I went completely ghost, which I ended up getting sick, and then with the holidays, it is what it is. But you know, the wonderful thing about New Year's is that you can just start over.